Right, guys, I'm going to go through the sources one by one, just so that you have a good idea of what they're talking about. I'll go via the page numbers so that if you follow this on the video that I'm hoping to do, or if not, then just follow it by the page numbers in your booklet. Okay. So source one is people dancing in the street in Britain, and what it's getting at when it says, wouldn't it be funny if the siren went now? It's referring to the siren which indicated an air raid in Britain. So people would have to evacuate the streets and probably go underground if they were in London to the tube, or somewhere else, basically to the nearest air raid shelter. And it's just a sarcastic comment. There's no particular political motivation or anything like that. It's just a sarcastic comment, really. Therefore, probably unlikely to come up in your exam unless it's talking about the mood of the end of the war, with maybe a reason for why Labour got elected or something like that. Source 2, Tough Lamb, is Clement Attlee in the middle, who's the current Prime Minister in 1947. The context is a difficult winter. Not the winter of discontent, just a really harsh winter which affects industry, and the kind of post-war boom ends, so the economy is struggling a little bit, and the welfare reforms that Attlee wanted to put in aren't as easy as they were before. The guy behind Attlee, with his famous quiff, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but you can look that up yourselves in the book. But basically, all the people around him look bored and unimpressed by his flexing of his muscles. You can see that Attlee's significantly smaller than the others, and that's done on purpose. And his muscle, which he's shown, is not particularly big. That's also done on purpose. On the wall, you can see a sign which says Big Five in a cabinet. This is referring to the fact that these 5 people were the ones who controlled the decisions of the government. It wasn't the cabinet, which is the norm. The cabinet are, of course, the people who were chosen by the Prime Minister to represent different areas of the government: economy, education, health, whatever. But Attlee uses these 5, this Big Five, this inner cabinet, in order to make decisions. The comment, and in case there's any more talk about my being just a good committee man, again, it's referring to the fact that he's flexing his muscles, he's showing that he's willing to be more than someone who sits on the board of a company, or in this case the government. He's willing to get involved and get his hands dirty and flex his muscles. Again, the irony is that his muscles aren't that big and they're not impressed by him. So the comment, Tough Lamb, really refers to the fact that he's acting tough, but really he's a sheep, basically. He's a small sheep. So yeah, not that tough. Right, the third source, which shows Winston Churchill putting a placard of Woodford into many different places in the UK, including Scotland and Ireland. It highlights the fact that the Tories relied on Churchill's personality in the election of 1945. I've put on the text in the Tory dream, Churchill was a Tory representative in every seat. That's all this means. I mean, what you can read into this what you like. One thing you could say is that that's all the Conservatives had. They had the personality of Churchill, and that was it. Another thing is, you could read into it that they this person who's made this cartoon, Victor Weiss, that they've overemphasized the role of Churchill's personality, and it's all they have, really. Anything else? Not really. It says at the bottom, Tory dream again, so that's just clearly saying that that's what the Tories wanted. Source 4, again highlighting or focusing on the 1945 election. You've got 2 people here. You've got Lord Beaverbrook in the background, who was in charge of the press, really, Beaverbrook and Rothermere, and they were very keen Tories, as the source says as well. What he is doing is he's highlighting the role of Lasky, someone who's in the Labour Party and linked with communism. So they're trying to scare the voters by talking about the Labour Party. The voter, which it says elector on his jacket, talking to Churchill, is saying, yeah, but what's your programme? What do you actually do? I don't want to know what Labour Party don't do or what's bad about them, but I want to know what you actually do. And Churchill's struggling to hear him. Again, this is just focusing again on the fact that in the 1945 election, the Conservatives focused on Labour bad as opposed to Conservative good. Labour were able to focus on what they would do if they were put in power because they had a very progressive manifesto. Source 5, I know we talked about this one in class, but I'll go through it again. You've got a gentleman in a light grey suit with label people on him, and he's walking, if you look in front of where he's walking, it says to the socialist era, and he's walking over what looks like the traditional Tory politician, should we say, white, old and balding, and he's saying make way, as in get out the way. When you look at the man and compare to the other men, he's bigger, he's younger, he's taller, and he's got a distinct vision, whereas the rest are clearly older. It's what the source is getting at is that the socialist way is the new way, the progressive way, and the people are going to follow this, really, or the people are going to lead this toward the socialist era. Right, source 6 is about America, and you can see there's 3 key players in this. There's the person who's thinking at the bottom, and he's in it twice, and then there's 2 people at the top. Saying in the first, effectively scene on the left, he says, "What a headache sometimes to be with America." So you can see the typical American, brash, loud, in your face, and it's referring to Britain's economic links with America and effectively their dependence on them after the Second World War. On the right, however, it shows a very different perspective. What if we didn't have America? And basically, if we don't have America, we have Russia. Okay, so you're going to be dominated by one of these 2 superpowers which are emerging after the Second World War. Which is it going to be? Stalin himself, who's in the picture on the right, representing Russia, he's got a sack, as in that he's going to put that bloke into, and he's also got a finger saying, "Come here." So it's a bit imposing and a bit threatening. So the general message of the source is that America, bad, but not as bad as the potential alternative of Russia, communist Russia under Stalin. What you got to remember is that in Europe at this time there was a genuine fear that another war might break out and that Europe would be attempted to be annexed by Soviet Russia or taken over by Soviet Russia as well. Right, source 7 or source O is particularly difficult because there's a lot going on and there's a lot of key characters in this source. Again, it's by Vicky Victor Weiss in the News Chronicle 1951. We know, obviously, that the Labour Party are experiencing a split at this point, and this source is about that split. On the top of the picture, you've got Herbert Morrison on the left, dressed as a woman with a holding a handbag, and you've got Clement Attlee. They were more central than the people on the left. You can see Wilson, Bevan, who's not labelled, Foote and Mikado. Wilson opposed a scale of rearmament. It mentions that in the book. Also, Bevan was against the prescription charges which were imposed. And they believed that they couldn't work in a Labour government, or a Labour cabinet particularly, which advocated those things. On the other hand, on the other side of the street, you've got Attlee and Morrison, who believe that that was just a necessary part of government. What it's saying is one way only, as in down the road, towards socialism, similar in a way to the one we just looked at. However, you can see Attlee and Morrison who are saying socialists, as in pesky socialists, how annoying, because they are too left-wing. So simply again, just to summarise, this source demonstrates a split between the Labour Party, those who were progressively socialist and those who were left of centre but still central of the political line. Right, again, before we start with source 8, let's identify what we can see in the picture. There's a house which is under production. It says that underneath the house, that's being propped up by something. The house on the door says higher standards of living. And in the house, you see shorter hours, higher wages, and TUC labelled on a horse, Trade Union Congress. Now, the 3 gentlemen inspecting that house, there's an expression in English which is to have poor foundations. Basically, this house literally has poor foundations. The foundations of this house are being propped up. The house itself, higher wages, shorter hours, higher standards of living. Clearly, what they're getting at is this wasn't sustainable. Okay, it wasn't built on sound economic principles. You can see Herbert Morrison and Attlee inspecting the house. Don't know what they're saying. Oh, sorry, you can see what they're saying. They're saying, I'll attend to the foundations later. This is getting at the fact that they weren't worrying about whether there was the economic structure already there for the welfare improvements that they were making. They would worry about that later. Simply, they will build on that surface now. The potential risk is that that would all come falling down and the improvements that they made would be lost. But they're not worrying about that. They're saying, I'll attend to the foundations later. Obviously, this, from the cartoonist point of view, David Lowe, is quite sarcastic. What he's getting at is that these people can't see that the foundations are so important, and without the foundations, it simply won't work. But they're ignoring that for now. In source 9, you can see a mask of Clement Attlee, and behind it, Aneurin Bevan. Now, what it's saying at the top of the poster is the Socialists election poster. Now, the Conservatives refer to the Labour Party as socialists for a long time, largely to discourage people from voting for them, because it sounded more extreme and people weren't as familiar with it and they didn't trust it. What this poster is getting at is the fact that if you vote for Clement Attlee, actually it will just be Bevan wearing a Clement Attlee mask, as in that Bevan is actually the one who makes all of the decisions. So actually, if you're voting for Labour, you're voting for socialism. And you can trust Mr. Attlee, it says at the bottom. Obviously that's an ironic. There's a lot of sarcasm in these posters, remember. Source 10 depicts Harold Macmillan as flying through the air almost like a Superman. So he's not Superman, he's Super Mac. There's a lot of irony and sarcasm in this source. He's got number 10 on the front as opposed to a S for Superman. And the point is that it's an ironic poster. He's not actually that good. And it shows this by saying how to stay on top without actually having been there. The point being, he's never been on top. He doesn't really know what he's doing. He's not competent in what he's doing. Note, Mac's torso is of course padded. Again, just another cheap swipe really at Harold Macmillan. It will be interesting to look at 1958 November in particular. What had just happened at this time, that made this come out now and not 6 months earlier or 6 months later for your exam? It's certainly worth looking at your timelines and seeing what was happening to the Conservative Party at this point. Right, source 11, what can we see? We can see Marks and Spencer, but not Marks, M-A-R-K-S, spelled with an X instead. Marks and Spencer is a very popular high street store in the UK, and it says here it's under new management, as in Marks. Now, Marks is referring to is Karl, our founder, which you can see on the pedestal on the left. Karl Marx being the guy who gave birth to the idea of communism. He invented communism, for want of a better expression. And you can see it's Harold Wilson who is clearly in charge of this. It's Wilson because of his wavy hair and his pipe. So the purpose of what it's getting at is that the economy was being managed by more socialist-minded people. Or at least that's what it's trying to get at. Right, source 12, lots to go through for this source in particular. First of all, on the left is Christine Keeler, who's at the heart of the Profumo affair. You can see John Profumo on the boat, who was steering the Conservative ship. That really just means that he's an important person, and Harold Macmillan is clearly trying to jump to his rescue as he's got distracted by Christine Keeler. Wilson, on the bottom of the picture, Harold Wilson, it's Wilson again because of the pipe, he's just helpfully or unhelpfully guiding the Tory boat towards the rocks, which it was heading to anyway because of the scandal of John Profumo. So basically what it's getting at is that the scandal of the Profumo affair damaged the Tory party and it led them towards danger. Harold Macmillan, to be fair, did a good job in rescuing the situation, but it's merely pointing out that this was a scandal and it wasn't helpful to the government. Right, source 13, you can see two groups of people, one of which represents law and order, and the other one represents the civilized society. Clearly, this source favours the people for law and order. So that would be the Conservative Party this time, as it was Labour who was trying to introduce the civilised society. You can see at the bottom it says, help our civilised society is being menaced by savages. Again, just an ironic jab at the fact that actually Law and Order look like the sensible party here, and the guys on the left certainly don't. What they mean, they're different things. You can see crime, pot, blue films, demos. What that's referring to is obviously crime and drugs. Blue refers to pornography really, but it's more a reduction in censorship. You didn't have to censor images. And demos being public strikes and that kind of thing, and public demonstrations of lack of support. So you can see here the guy holding the stick, whose name I can't remember, but I'll pop it on the annotation in a second. He's saying permissive society is a civilized society. And he looks like a bit of a fool because they look like a bunch of savages. So the general message of the source is that the Labour Party have gone too far with their civilised society and actually just made it a permissive society, which is very different, and where anything goes really, kind of one step towards anarchy. In source 14, there's a number of different people and things you can see. On the far top left, you can see miners celebrating as they're throwing flowers onto the carriage which carries Joe Gormley, the president of the National Union of Miners. Behind Gormley, attached to the carriage, is Edward Heath, the leader of the Conservative Party. And there's a couple of generals behind him as well. On the carriage, it says Gormley, the name of Joe Gormley, Imperator Rex meaning Emperor King in Latin. And the caption says Caesar's Triumph. Just on the left of that, you can see Harold Wilson laying down and worshipping at the feet of Gormley. Now, what this all means is fairly straightforward. There was an election in which there was a hung parliament. So neither the Labour Party nor the Conservative Party gained enough seats to have an outright majority. Heath had fought the election on the slogan, "Who governs Britain?" as a question. Clearly, the electorate had decided that he didn't. So what happened was that Harold Wilson eventually created a government. But the significance of it was that it was a split or a hung parliament, therefore suggesting that the miners' power was very... Heath had intended to fight this election and win it in order to strengthen his hand against the unions when he was dealing with them, except clearly this hadn't worked, and that's demonstrated by the fact that he's attached them naked as well behind Gormley. Right, source 15. Very clearly you've got cabinet members sitting in a boat, half of which are rowing one way and half of which are rowing another. In the background, you can see Little England and Europe. Some of them are pushing towards Europe, some of them are pushing towards Little England, aka away from Europe. You can identify some of the people on the boat. On the far left, the coxswain, the leader of the boat, is Wilson, Harold Wilson. On the far right, I think, is Roy Jenkins. Anyway, Jenkins was in. He was a pro-Europe kind of guy. You should know at least one of the others who were out as well. Fourth from the right is Barbara Castle. I can't really identify any of the other ones, but I'm sure you guys could if you looked up members of the cabinet from this time. Members of the cabinet were James Callaghan, Dennis Healey, Lord Elwyn Jones, Roy Jenkins, Barbara Castle, Roy Mason, William Ross, Michael Ford, and plenty of others. Okay, source 16. Two main people are Tony Benn, who's cracking the whip on the Labour horse, and Harold Wilson. You can see in the background, you can see a fence, and it says Harold sat here. He was sitting on the fence about nationalisation. Now, Tony Benn wanted to nationalise everything, because it says on the placard that he's holding. However, really, this is a link to the top 25 firms in the country that he wanted to nationalise, so to take over with the government. The indication of the cartoon is that Tony Benn was taking Labour into a dangerous place, and that Wilson was trying to rein them back and to save them from going off the edge of the cliff, so to speak. This is a common accusation for Labour, that they were too socialist and they wouldn't appeal to the electorate. To be fair, it's probably quite accurate. Labour never really, possibly with the exception of 1945, appealed with a particularly socialist manifesto, and won an election. So what Harold Wilson is trying to do, he's trying to get Ben back on board and get him to be more central and more, well, in the middle of politics and less left-wing and less socialist, by stopping him from nationalising everything. You can see the Labour horse is beaten up, it's patched up, and there are internal struggles within, because you can see there are people strangling each other and putting their hands on other people's heads and squashing them down, etc. So Labour are clearly in a state, and Harold Wilson is trying to save them. As you can see, he's saying, "Damn thing is still trying to kick me." A reference to the fact that he's trying to save it, but the party itself isn't making it easy for him by people like Ben trying to kind of push their own political agendas through nationalisation. On to source 17. There are three things you need to understand before you look at this source. Britain was seen as one American commentator said, drifting slowly towards a condition of ungovernability. The reason for this, or the reasons for this, are high living standards. They were beginning to fall for the first time in a long time, in 40 years. There was also a really high tax. Unearned income was 98%, and the highest tax on earned income was 83%. Inflation as well was rising rapidly, and it was reducing the real amount of savings that people had. So living standards were falling, tax was high, and inflation was growing. The indication of this is that people didn't want to come to Britain, or people shouldn't have wanted to come to Britain. However, in the source, you see people from outside of Britain crossing into the border, looks like illegally as they're doing from a boat. However, the people who are stopping them are not the police, which is what you would expect for illegal immigrants. They're actually psychiatrists. And the joke is that why on earth would these people want to come to Britain when it's in such a poor state? It's not a particularly good joke, but it's a joke nonetheless. Just so you know, the writing in the background that you can see in the sky is the other side of the newspaper that this was taken from. It's anything to do with this source. Oh, another thing, you can see strikes gloom despair written on the newspaper that one of the psychiatrists is holding as well. So that's a link to what was going on at the time. Right, on the right of this picture represents the Labour Party. Michael Foot is standing over Labour's election hopes, and he's giving them the kiss of death, meaning he's eliminating any chance that they could possibly be successful. He was too left-wing, to put it bluntly. He was not the intended chosen leader that Callaghan had wanted. Callaghan was 70 in 1981, and he retired, and he hoped Denis Healey would take the leadership. However, he didn't. The party chose Michael Foot. And he was an old school left-wing politician, and he stood for things that weren't really in keeping with what people wanted, a more centralised political party, really. So you can see he's being said the kiss of death, meaning there's no chance that Labour would win the election. On the left of the picture, you can see David Steele being stood over by four people, the original gang of four. However, it was Roy Jenkins on the left, a prince from over the water, which is his nickname given to him due to the work he did in Europe. Also, what they're trying to do here is they're trying to revive the liberal movement, which is what people want, which is kind of the same point that the right-hand side of the source is making, is that people wanted a more centralised political party. So the overall message of the source is that the Conservative Party benefited from what was happening elsewhere in politics. The Central Liberal Party was struggling to get together as one, whereas the left-wing element of politics, they weren't really appealing to the central need for what people wanted at the time. Source 19 is pretty straightforward, and it has been on the exam before. Arthur Scargill, in the centre of the picture, is inadvertently destroying industry whilst trying to destroy democracy, represented by the Houses of Parliament. He's unaware he's doing so. Flight picketing, the time he chose to strike, a number of different reasons. I mean, striking wasn't particularly popular with the mining communities. 50,000 out of 70,000 opposed striking. So he did it anyway, but he did it through flight picketing. Or that's how he put pressure on the government. So it's like an attack on democracy. Yet actually it was doing the industry more harm than Parliament and democracy itself. Source number 20, you can see Ben and Heifer leadership campaign and opportunities for them to take leadership of the party. It was rubbish, basically. They weren't successful at all, and all this source is getting at is that socialism, led by Ben and Heifer, had died, and the reason the horse is not moving is because it's died laughing, because it was such a ridiculous thought for them to genuinely challenge the Labour leadership under the guise of socialism. Source 20 shows Margaret Thatcher, represented by the Concorde, flying past at some speed the Labour Party represented by a hot air balloon. Expression in English, to talk a load of hot air or something and the like, basically meant they were talking rubbish. They didn't really know what they were talking about. You can see on the windbag it says hot air attempts across the next 5 years. So the source is getting at the fact that Thatcher knew what she was doing, where she was going, and she was getting there fast, whereas Labour didn't really know what they were doing, and they were therefore going extremely slowly. Source 21. Two people, Michael Heseltine on the left and Margaret Thatcher on the right. You have to kind of understand the context of Tarzan and Jane for this. If you don't know it, YouTube it. Tarzan and Jane. So basically what you've got is you've got this man in the jungle who's the kind of how would you describe him? He's kind of like a wild man who protects Jane and looks after Jane, and he's definitely the boss. Now, his nickname, Michael Heseltine, was Tarzan because of his blonde flowing locks and the way he kind of presented himself. What Thatcher is getting at here is, no, Michael, you've got it wrong. You, Michael, me, Tarzan. That she's the boss, she is Tarzan, and he is the one who is the kind of understudy. Whereas she obviously thought that, or the person who's drawn the cartoon obviously felt that Thatcher thought that Heseltine was getting too big for his boots. So this is simply Thatcher telling Heseltine where his place is, putting him in his place. Finally, the last one, source 23. You can see Geoffrey Howe driving literally the economy, yet it's got a flat tyre. So this is kind of an indication, and it's got a burst radiator. It's an indication that the economy is stalling or is having difficulties. Thatcher is in the back seat, and Howe is saying to Thatcher, if you're such a good backseat driver, you know, you can change the wheel yourself. You can fix the problems yourself. Thatcher is very didactic. She kind of liked to tell others what to do, especially with the economy. She had her ideas of how the economy should work. And all this is getting at is that Geoffrey Howe had enough. He was always getting a lot of stick from Thatcher, and he's had enough, and he decides to let her take over so she can deal with the problems herself. Now, if you're unaware of what a backseat driver is, it's someone who sits in the back of a car and is constantly mithering the person in the front, telling them what they should be doing, what they shouldn't be doing. So the fact that she's in a backseat and she's called the backseat driver is, again, it's a way of expressing that Thatcher was too involved, was trying to take over, which is very like her entire premiership, really. Okay, that's it. If you've got any questions, just come in and let me know, or pop me an email, and I will do my best to answer them. Hope you find it useful, guys.